Hello everyone, welcome to Setco College online classes. Today we're going to talk about grade 11 life science. So I brought the ATP here to help us see what's going to happen. So you can pause the video and try and follow the ATP and see the topics that we're going to cover. So in this week we're going to cover the basic structure of viruses, bacteria, protista, and fungi, which is pretty much microorganisms. So we're going to look at how the role they play in the interdependence of living organisms, or the role they play in the ecosystem. Remember, all living organisms, they depend on one another. Some they are food producers and some are food consumers. For example, we've got grasses, which is pretty much plants. They are able to produce their own food through photosynthesis. And we've got other organisms such as, let's say, predators. They cannot make their own food, so they depend on other organisms. We also have viruses and pretty much all the animals that we classify as parasites. They can live off other organisms. So other organisms need other organisms for them to survive. So that's pretty much what we're going to talk about today in this topic. So without wasting much of your time, let's get to it. So down here I wrote biodiversity and classification of living organisms. So you notice that living organisms, we classify them into 5 kingdoms, which are the kingdom Monera, which is pretty much bacteria, and Animalia, which is animals, Plantae, which is plants, Protista, and fungi. Okay, so before we go any further, I want you to remember the properties or the characteristics of all living organisms. Living organisms, they should be able to respire. They should be able to respire. They should be able to feed. Living organisms, they should be able to feed. Also remember, living organisms, they need to excrete. So excretion is part of living organisms. So they feed, they respire. So this is pretty much breathing. Okay, everyone understand what we mean by feeding. So this is when we release. People normally confuse this with defecation. This is pretty much when we release waste salts and excess water in our bodies. And also plants do the same thing when they've got extra mineral salts that they don't need, so they tend to excrete. The other 2, they should be 5. Then the other 2 I'm going to give you to look at it as homework. Okay, let's get into it. Remember from grade 10, you were told that there are some characteristics of these living organisms when they are classified in these 5 kingdoms. For example, you knew that kingdom Monera doesn't have a definite nucleus, so we can refer to them as prokaryotes. And you can also talk of the kingdom of Protista, which is pretty much unicellular, or they have got one cell. Okay, then we can talk of plants and animals. Those are mostly multicellular, so it means they have got more than one cell in their bodies. Okay, so the first one that we're going to look at today, it is the easiest. We're going to look at bacteria. Or should we start with the virus before we get to the bacteria? Let's start with the virus because it will shed some light, or it will help us understand what is going on. So a virus, the first thing that we need to understand with the viruses is that they can act as living. They can act both as living organisms or also as non-living organisms. That's the very first thing that we need to understand. The second thing we need to understand about viruses is that they are very small. Very small, and for that case we call them, they are microorganisms. Microorganisms, which means we can only see them under the use of a microscope. So for us to view what is happening with the viruses, we need to use a very powerful microscope. So these ones, we cannot see them with our naked eye. We need to use the microscope. So normally we use the electron microscope for these ones. It's an electron microscope. You notice that some of the bacteria, we cannot actually see them when we use a light microscope, unless the light microscope is very powerful. So we normally use electron microscope to view viruses. Some light microscopes, they can also work, but they have to be a powerful light microscope. Okay, microscope. Okay, then so to understand how small viruses are, they have got a very, very small diameter. A diameter, remember, the distance between. There we go. So there's a diameter between. So it's the distance between two. Oh boy. So there's our diameter, the distance between the circumference. Okay, so it has to be the larger distance. So if you look at the diameter of this thing, it's pretty much 20 nanometers, or 20 times 10 to the power minus 9 meters. This is a very, very small number. So that's how small the viruses are. So how then do we say these viruses, we can classify them as living or non-living? Remember, viruses, they can live in crystalline form. Viruses, they tend to live in crystalline form. They tend to live in crystalline form. Even for years, they can live in this form even for years without anything happening to them. And they can tend to activate when they get inside a host. Then they can start showing the signs of living organisms. So they can live for years in this form. They do not respire. So they also non-living, because we can say they are non-living. Why? Because they do not respire. They don't respire when they're in this form. So they just tend. Imagine, how can we say this is a living organism if it cannot breathe in or out? It's difficult. Okay. They don't also reproduce. In this form, when they are in this form, they cannot reproduce. So they don't reproduce. No reproduction. Nothing is happening here. They can't reproduce. So if they cannot reproduce, then they're not living organisms, because we need our living organisms to reproduce so that generations can keep going on and on. So the viruses, they can show those symptoms of non-living organisms. Okay, let's move on. Let's look at the basic structure of these viruses. Remember, the very first thing that I said is that they are very small. So you also know, so when you're looking at the basic structure of viruses, basic structure. Okay, so the first thing that we need to know that they are very small. Very, very small. Okay, but there's a comparison that we need to make there. Remember, when you say they are very small, us as living, as humans, the smallest organism that we can say is living, that shows the characteristics of living organisms, which is respire, reproduce, feed, and stuff like that. It is bacteria. Bacteria shows all the characteristics of living organisms. So we tend to structure viruses as non-living organisms unless they are inside a host. So they are very small than bacteria. The one that we normally say is the smallest living organism, bacteria. But viruses, when they are inside a host, they become the smallest living organisms. But when they are outside of a host, they are not living organisms. Okay, so they are very small, and I said the diameter is approximately, they've got a diameter of approximately 20 nanometers. So their diameter is approximately 20 nanometers. Okay, so most viruses can only be seen under electron microscope. I think I have already established that. And they have symmetrical shapes. There's symmetry happening with the viruses, so they've got symmetrical shapes. Please, if you think you can forget some of these things, you can take them down. So viruses, they've got a symmetrical shapes. They tend to show symmetrical shapes in their structures. Okay, so some can be spherical, some they can be rod-like, some can be like spirals. So to understand it, remember as any shape that is symmetrical. For example, if I draw a rectangle, there's my rectangle. Okay, what to note there with the rectangle is that I can divide it like this. Okay, and then I've got two sides of the rectangle that are equal after dividing, so that makes it symmetrical. I can divide it like that, then it's also symmetrical. I've got two sides that are exactly the same. I can divide it like that, I can divide it like that, so that makes it multi-symmetry. Okay, now as we go on, we also need to understand that virus consists of central core of the nucleic acid. So remember, these viruses, they from grade 10, they do not have they only have a central core. They do not have a definite nucleus. Remember, they don't have a definite nucleus, but they tend to show a central core. So to understand this, let me draw a small diagram of how this virus looks like, then we can try and explain it from there. So a virus will then look like something like this. So forgive my drawing, I'm not that good with drawings. Okay, so we might have something like that. Then I have that. Okay, so there at the bottom, then you have something like that, and it tends to be circular. Then you end up having small things happening there. Okay, then there's something that is budding off from it, something like that. Then it buds off from something like that. Then from this point, we also have something like that, something like that. So this is a basic structure of bacteria. So inside here, it doesn't have a nucleus, remember? So it tends to be something like that. So this is the central core. This is the central core. So in here we have the outer protein coat. I'll explain the functions of these things. So the outer protein coat, we have the DNA there. Remember, the DNA controls the functions of cells, remember? So this controls the functions of the cells. So we also have the internal proteins happening inside. So there's internal proteins there happening inside. Okay, so there at the bottom we have got this circular part, we call it the end plate. So this is the end plate. There's the end plate. Then we've got tail fibers there. So these small things here, these are tail fibers. Okay, then this is the tail. So we've got a tail there. This is the head, the neck. So the neck is pretty much there. So this is the basic structure of a virus, any virus. Okay. So we consider these viruses to be non-cellular or acellular, since they have no nucleus. Remember, for us to say nucleus is the one that controls the cell functions of all living organisms. Inside the nucleus, that's where we control the cell functions. So these ones, they tend to have a central core, which is this little thing here, this little guy here. Inside, we call it the central core, and inside the central core there's no nucleus. We have DNA, yes, but we don't have the nucleus. Okay, then so the general characteristics of a virus is you need to understand that viruses, they show the parasitic behavior, or they are all parasites. All viruses are parasites, which means they live either in plants, or in animals, or in bacteria. They tend to feed, or they tend to live on other organisms. Okay, so that's a point to note, that all viruses All viruses, all of them, they are parasites. They are parasites. Parasites. And by parasites we mean they live off other organisms. They live off other organisms. Forgive my handwriting, very bad. Okay, viruses are absolutely specific with regard to their hosts. What does that mean? So it means viruses, they also tend to choose the kind of host they are going to live off. They don't just live in any host. So for example, a virus that tend to live on plants, it cannot survive in animals. The one that live in animals cannot survive in plants. Okay, viruses may cause diseases in plants and in animals. For example, we already know that there's rabies, we've got mumps, we've got AIDS. AIDS, remember, is caused from the HIV virus, which leads to AIDS. Smallpox, poliomyelitis, yellow fever, etc., etc., they are caused by viruses. Viruses reproduce by transforming the host nucleic acids into virus nucleic acids when they can multiply. So this is very, very important. Remember, viruses, they don't reproduce like other animals do. For example, you know that there's going to be a fusion of the female and the male nucleuses in the sperm cells, then we end up having an offspring. With the viruses, they take over the DNA of a living organisms where they are going to be, where they take over. For example, let's say a virus takes over me, then it goes into my DNA, it controls the DNA structure of that particular cell, takes over. Then when the DNA is replicating itself, it's no longer the DNA of the living organisms where it has taken over. It's now the DNA of the virus, which means what is replicating is the DNA of the virus within a body of the living organisms that they take over. That is very, very important. Okay, so that's pretty much what we have with the viruses. So important points to note. In any questions, for example, questions that might get, remember, viruses very, very small, and you also need to be able to draw the structure of a virus and label it. Remember this structure, you need to be able to draw it and label it from your head. Okay, then points to remember, viruses, they are very, very small. What do? They live off other organisms. We can classify them as living or non-living. In a non-living form, they can form crystals where they can live for many years without reproducing, without respiring. And in that form, we cannot call them living organisms. But the moment they enter a host body where they are now living off that organism, taking over the DNA of that organism, they tend to show the characteristics of living organisms, which means they can now reproduce. They can now take over, by how they reproduce, they take over the DNA of that particular living organism. Okay, so also remember, all viruses, they are parasites. Remember also that viruses, they tend to choose the kind of host they're going to take. They are very, very specific when it comes to their host. They don't just take any host. If you take a virus that lives off plants, you put it in an animal, it's going to die. It won't survive in that environment because they are very, very specific when it comes to choosing their hosts. It's like enzymes. Remember, they are very substrate specific. Okay, then that's it. Also, another thing to remember the flu virus. Flu is caused by a virus. And we can only reduce its effects. Now let's look at what is happening with another living organism which is very small, and that organism is bacteria. There are different types of bacteria. You need to remember that. You need to know that. So what is happening with the bacteria, guys? Bacteria are pretty much 50 times smaller, 50 times bigger than the viruses. They are a bit bigger, and known to man, bacteria becomes the smallest living organisms because it shows all characteristics of living organisms. Okay, So bacteria tends to live in dark places, where there's lack of sunlight. They love moisture. Bacteria, they love moisture. So bacteria, they are approximately 50 times bigger than viruses. Okay, so they tend to be 50 times bigger than viruses. And bacteria lives or survives better in dark environments, okay, where there's no sunlight. So they tend to live in dark environments, and also preferably where there is moisture. So they love their moisture. Okay, and one thing I don't like about bacteria is that they tend to do very well between the temperatures of 30 and 37 degrees Celsius. So they tend to reproduce and do well. So they tend to reproduce. You understand why I don't like this part of bacteria. They tend to reproduce at temperatures around 30 to 37 degrees Celsius. Okay, and guess what? This is the normal body temperature of a human being. So this is our normal body temperature. Okay, so that makes bacteria dangerous to us, because at these temperatures, bacteria is producing very, very well. It's pretty much its optimal temperatures. So that makes it dangerous to us. But also, bacteria, they've got a higher temperature range in which they can operate. They can be fine, okay, they can be inactive, or they cannot be operating well at temperatures between 18 degrees Celsius, but they are fine to a temperature range of around 70 degrees Celsius. Around 70 degrees, that's a very huge temperature range there. So it means bacteria, they can survive in these temperatures, which is very extreme. And that makes them dangerous, which means if you say you cook food that has been attacked by bacteria, you need to boil it, or you need to cook it to over 70 degrees Celsius if you've got a chance of eating that without being damaged. So I prefer you cover off any food that you think you might wanna eat later during the day after cooking it. I prefer people eat warm food anyway. Anyway, so let's look at the basic structure of bacteria. So, like I said earlier, we normally say bacteria are the smallest living organisms, but that doesn't mean they are bigger than viruses, but that doesn't mean that we can see them with our naked eye. We still need a microscope. But unlike viruses, most bacteria, we can see it with a light microscope, a powerful light microscope. We can actually see bacteria. But when it comes to some of the bacteria, it's so small that we're also going to need the electron microscope. Okay, so each bacterium is made up of one cell, i.e. bacteria is unicellular. That is a very important point to note there. So we are saying bacteria unicellular. Sorry there, it's unicellular. Okay, what does that mean? It means there is one cell. They only have one cell. Okay, unicellular. Bacteria, they tend to have one cell. Okay, so there are four shapes that bacteria normally takes, and these are coccus, bacillus, spirillum, and vibrio. So I assume that you have got textbooks. If you do not, please try and get one for yourself, so that you can see these shapes. So, but in coccus form, it's pretty much when it buds on the cells, they tend to bud on top of one another like that. Then we call that coccus. Okay. Then with bacillus, they are pretty much cylindrical in shape, and they tend to look like that. Okay. Then the other two, look them in the textbook and you see how they look. Okay, so each bacterial cell, irrespective of its shape, has the following structures. Look at the structures that we're going to have there. Main bacterial cells, they've got a slime capsule. So what is the slime capsule? I will draw the structure of a bacteria there, then I'll show you. But the slime capsule is pretty much the cover that we have outside the bacteria. It tends to protect the bacteria from drying out. Remember, the bacteria, they are very small and they are unicellular, so they are prone to drying out. So they tend to have a slime capsule. A capsule, remember, we've got those peels that have got a plastic coating outside. So if you look, most of those peels that we have there, they've got a plastic coating. They tend to react with the oxygen. The same thing is happening with bacteria. They have got a sensitive part which is inside. So to protect the sensitive part, we end up having the slime capsule which protects it from drying out. So they also have the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is cell membrane, it's covered by cell membrane or plasma lemma within the cell. Remember, okay, we'll talk more when I'm drawing the structure of that bacteria, then I'll explain what's going on to it. Okay, so we also have the nucleus. Remember, now this is bacteria, not the virus. So there's a nucleus going on there, and inside the nucleus there's a chromatin network, and we also have the DNA there. Okay, so that gives it that makes it a living organism which is smaller. Okay, they also have ribosomes okay, within the cytoplasm, but there are no mitochondria, plastids or endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, that is very interesting, but I'll explain more as we go on. Also, a cell wall made up of polysaccharides, proteins, lipids also occurs outside. Okay, let's have the structure of this bacteria, then we'll try and explain what's going on afterwards. So, like I said, please guys forgive my drawings. I'll try to be as neat as possible. Okay, so we tend to have something like this with bacteria. Then we've got our little DNA structure happening there. Okay, then in here something is happening. Okay, then we end up having those little guys that look like sperm cells. Grade 12s, they will understand what I'm talking about here. Okay, then from there we have got our slime capsule. So this is the slime capsule. The slime capsule. So this one is the slime capsule. And remember its job. Sorry, this is the slime capsule, and its job. This prevents the bacterium. So bacterium is just a singular form of bacteria. So bacterium from dying out. So this one prevents bacterium from drying out and eventually dies. Okay. Then we've got the nucleate. There's the nucleate happening there. We've got the nucleate there. Then we've got these little guys. We call them flagellum. Yeah, these little guys here, we call them flagellum. Then we've got the cytoplasm. We've got the cytoplasms. Then if you notice closely in those diagrams, remember this is a living organism, so it does have ribosomes. It does have ribosomes there. Then we've got the cell membrane. Here is the cell membrane. Okay, cell membrane. Cell membrane. And we should have a cell wall somewhere. We should have a cell wall somewhere. Let's put it there. So outside there, that's the cell wall. Okay, so what is the purpose of these things that we are writing? The cytoplasm, this guy here, occurs within the cell wall. So remember, we have it, it's in the cell wall. But what is it doing, the cytoplasm? we know it's covered by the cell membrane. Remember, this is the cell membrane, the outer part. So the cell membrane is covering the cytoplasm, and it contains this. Okay, let's not get into detail for now.